Welcome to the Doubts Aloud podcast. We are three agnostic/atheist voices based in the UK, or from across the pond for any listeners in the US. We have an avid interest in discussing religion and theism with a strong emphasis on Christianity. We seek to elucidate, reflect and critique in a respectful manner such issues to do with apologetics, doctrines, science, faith, archaeology and biblical studies. We also will have interviews of some very interesting people from both religious and secular points of view. Welcome back to the Doubts Aloud podcast, and on this episode we've got some very, very interesting subjects coming up. We've got some news from Ed, which we'll get into very soon. We've got interesting Is That in the Bible, and other sections that we are developing through here. So Ed, let's kick right into the news.
Well, this is about Justin Brierley's book. He wrote it and it was published about a year ago, and he's the host of the Unbelievable show that we all rate so much. He's a great chap, and he's written an apologetics book that is obviously promoted on the show a lot. And he's explaining why he's still a Christian despite all these discussions with atheists on Unbelievable. And it's gone down well, it's well written, and a group of kind of fans who are atheists have given him the respect of a response book. And Skydive Phil is one of them, who's well known from us for the discussion group and other contributions on Unbelievable. And there's some Americans, and I've done a chapter as well. I responded to Justin's work on the resurrection, which is sort of one of my things. So if people are keen to see... well, obviously they need to read Justin's book. That's the most important thing. But if they are interested in a response book, then look up... At the moment, it's on something called Reason Press. reasonpress.net. All one word, reasonpress.net.
I gather that somebody had a criticism of that Reason Press.
Yes.
Yes.
They feel that... well, it's an American... The Americans were the ones who chose it. And it is a sort of American thing to... Like Integrity Ministries or something. You wouldn't get that from a British outlet, would you? So yeah. I think they're just trying to show where they're coming from rather than to say that we have a monopoly on reason.
Yeah, fair enough. Okay, moving on to other news items.
Well, Andrew, there was the talk that we had at the Unbelievable Skeptics group, where, of course, you delivered the talk. And it was on the question of whether Jesus, a failed apocalyptic prophet, and it was very well received. I was there, and I thought it was brilliant.
Well, I would love us to pick up on your topic, and let's start by introducing it as... Is that in the Bible?
Is that really in the Bible?
Okay, well, in today's Is That in the Bible, this relates absolutely to my talk at the Unbelievable group, and the verse is Matthew 24, verse 34, which goes, "Truly I tell you, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened." Okay, Ed?
Well, obviously that's Jesus' voice. And what interested me was I had a quick check, and it's exactly the same in Mark, which Matthew, this gospel writer, is using as his principal source. And Luke, who also copies Mark, again doesn't edit it. It's exactly the same in Luke.
That's right, it is. And this verse... it is one of the foundational verses of the subject which I was talking about in the group, and that was the wider topic of basically the biblical language and understanding of what is called the end of the age. Some people in church history have called it the second coming of Jesus, or the end of all things, generally known in theological terms as all issues to do with eschatology. Let me just put a little bit of context. In the talk, basically in this subject, this verse really just opens up a can of worms to do with a general sort of feeling of the New Testament, really in the epistles in the book of Revelation, in the Gospels, there is this feeling of something cataclysmic, I can hardly say it, happening within the lifetime of the apostles. It's in Paul, it's in James. I've got some verses actually here that I used basically from my talk notes. I'm calling them the time statements. And then I'll go on to just ask what both of you sort of feel about those. But it's not just this verse that's talking about something ending soon or something happening majorly soon. There is the obvious in Matthew, the kingdom of heaven is at hand. The axe is already laid at the root of the trees. Matthew 10, the whole Matthew theme is all there. You shall not finish going through the cities of Israel until the Son of Man comes. Matthew 16, it gets even more sort of interesting. For the Son of Man is going to come with his angels in the glory of his Father, and then he will repay everyone for what he has done. Truly, I tell you, there are some standing here who will not taste death before they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. And then there's the verse that I just read. Ed, comments?
Well, I always love to start in Mark because it's the earliest and it's what the other ones are copying from. So how much of those verses do you think are unique to Matthew, and how many of them are copied from Mark?
I think that Matthew has his unique take on Mark, but he literally incorporates almost word for word these phrases, and so there's a whole another study and topic on why that might be the case. It does seem to me that what is fascinating about Matthew and Luke is that they draw so closely with Mark, but then they have extra bits, added nuances, and then they have what's called the parables of delay, which Mark doesn't have. So following on in the context of this whole Matthew 24 and the verse that we're doing for this section of the podcast is in fact keep watch, for you don't know the hour. So there's sort of he may be a long time coming. So there's this sort of thing that happens which Mark completely doesn't have. So some people argue that we're moving a little bit further on in time, and this expectation was starting to be just a little on edge. It's like, okay,
beginning to lose their nerve.
Beginning to lose their nerve a little bit with the hints of both of those Gospels. John is on another planet, as we know, and it's a very different story. So, Francis, some more comments from you on this.
Well, I think it was very interesting the way you went through in the talk the ways in which different people have managed to try and square this with the passage of time and the fact that here we all are and Jesus still isn't back, or certainly not noticeably back. And I suppose what you're saying is that this had already started in the later Gospels, that there was already a kind of defensive, we can explain this. This is all totally what we would have expected. Nothing to be alarmed about. All is going on track. Do you think that's fair?
It's sort of, yes. I mean, I started the talk by actually referring to a guy called Harold Camping, a US minister on TV for like 40 years, who had predicted in May 2011 that the rapture, that's an aspect of this end times that's a popular view, i.e. Jesus was coming back in some way to gather his believers on this date, and it didn't happen. People were waiting, they gave money up for the cause. It didn't happen. It was a failed expectation. This has happened all throughout church history. There's documented things about this. There's a book called I forget the name of the book now. It's gone blank on me. Oh dear. When Prophecy Fails.
Yes, I know. I mean, I haven't read the book, but I know of it, and it's a fascinating example of how we have that in there. It's part of human psychology that when things appear to go wrong, it tends to deepen your belief rather than undermine it.
Yes, one of the common themes that's definitely been documented, and Ed, this would probably be where your interest would come in on something like this, the psychology of it all and the sociology of it all, is that when things fail to happen as expected, you get one group that say, oh, well, this is nonsense, I'm off and out of here. That's really the least of the responses. It's so common to reinterpret, to spiritualize, to have we got the date wrong, reconfiguring, anything but failure. Can you say anything on that?
Yes, that's right. When Fessinger did the original research on that in the 50s, he said that the people who'd invested in the movement were the ones who could switch to this spiritualization of it, and the people who hadn't invested so deeply in the movement could just walk away.
That's exactly right. And so the essence of my talk was actually moving towards the fact that, most Christians of all persuasions, of all sort of stripes would say, look at these people. They're just ridiculous fundamentalists who are predicting and they can't accept the failure and da-da-da. But when you actually go back to the Bible, the argument can be made that in the New Testament you see this uneasiness and this adaptation and this sort of coming to terms with it. And the Gospel of John, in comparison to Mark, is phenomenally different in this area. It drops this expectation concept pretty clearly. Still has a very end of the age sort of scenario, but it has a different thing called realized eschatology. And one can argue that there is this tension right the way through the New Testament, because so much of it does have a near expectation, and then there's other verses that seem to counteract it. So one of the things in my talk was moving on to how people have understood the Bible in this throughout history. And one of the things that was really interesting was a radical movement called full preterism, which seeks to give an answer which is quite radical to most Christians, and yet it is coming from inspired Bible Reformed Christianity. And so did you find that interesting, Ed?
Yes. Obviously, I missed you when you talked to the group, but I have heard you talk on another podcast.
I get about, yes.
Yes, that's right, a year or so ago. And it's astounding. What I actually loved was the quote you gave of a Reformed kind of theologian preacher. So maybe you could show, give us that clip.
Yes, I managed to obtain that clip, but just to give the listeners, whether it's one of you or several of you by now, an idea of the context of this, the response, basically the second coming, the language of the end of the age has been an orthodox part of Christianity at various levels all through the last 2,000 years. But one thing is clear, that basically most people saw the end of the age as something future from them, i.e. even at the time when they were expecting it, 2nd century they were still expecting it, 3rd century they were still expecting it, and we go on and on and on. And so we would have inherited, Ed, in our churches, the idea of a future second coming, whether it was really a crucial element of your faith or whether it was just there. For you, it might have just been there. For me, it was a very crucial element. It was all about the future, which was happening, ironically, soon and shortly, the very language of the New Testament. However, there is a sort of a bastard offspring, if I can use that word on the podcast, in reaction to critical scholars, basically, largely critical scholars, I would say, who have basically pointed out the very text that I have been talking about, that are also in the epistles. It is the last hour, says in 1 John. The time is near in Revelation. And the saddest verse someone said in Book of Revelation is at the end, where it goes, "Yes, I'm coming soon." And so people have basically, I don't know, done gymnastics with those words all through church history. But there was a new group starting in the 19th century called preterism, or full preterism. They turned the whole thing about the second coming right on its head. And basically they say we need to accept the time text or the Bible is wrong. So I'm going to play you a clip now from a guy called David B. Curtis from a reformed sort of Calvinist group in the States, who really is a top speaker on this subject. And you're going to hear firsthand how this guy represents this view.
And I tell them, if this view is new to you, which to most people you talk to it will be, I'd ask that you just openly and honestly look at it. Look at what it's saying. Almost every book in the New Testament talks about a soon return of Jesus Christ. And it's very hard to make 2,000 years soon by any hermeneutic. You can't make 2,000 years be soon. But the major issue to me in all this, and this is what's important, the major issue with this is not eschatology. The major issue here is the inspiration of Scripture. That's what's important. That's what my fight is. That's what I'm willing to battle about. Inspiration. Because if Jesus said, I'm coming soon, then He had to come soon. If He said He was coming to that generation, He had to do it. He had to keep His word. And to me, that's what's important. So I would challenge you, either we've got these time statements all wrong, or the rest of the world has this whole idea wrong about the return of the Lord Jesus Christ.
Well, I think that's a good way of coming back, I suppose. You have to admire him for it being quite ingenious. My comment on it would be that if there's nothing to indicate that people did understand at the time that they were writing that prophecy had been fulfilled. Am I missing a point there somewhere?
Well, in essence, what's really happening with the full preterist movement to challenge the normal understanding of the second coming is preterism is to do with the Latin word past, as opposed to Christianity has normally seen the second coming as future, so they call them futurists. It's just like in your mother's milk, Jesus is coming back in our future because it hasn't happened. They turn everything on its head by as you can see from what we heard, by saying, look, these time statements, you can't do gymnastics with them. They mean what they mean. And so what they change is the whole concept of what the second coming was about. And so what they're saying, to answer your question, Francis, is that at the time of the characters in the New Testament, they would have seen that the end of the age hadn't come. Yes, fine. But the argument is that in AD 70, within a generation, that Jesus, in some sense, came in judgment and was vindicated in some sense after his death and resurrection in that generation. And then that was what the second coming was all about. And so they turn it on its head. It did happen soon. And in fact, for a full preterist, they have the Bible on their side because they say this is the greatest testimony to fulfilled prophecy whatsoever. Jesus came back within a generation in that sense. Ed?
It's astounding. You've got to do violence to something. You've got to do either violence to the timing, which is what most Christians do, or you do violence to what actually is predicted to have happened. One of those two, you have to say, it's all metaphor and the language isn't saying what it means. So if you say that this generation is literal and Jesus coming back and meeting him in the air and the trumpet sound and all that sort of stuff is metaphorical, you've then got the problem that there's a lot more that you're making metaphorical than just one verse. And also you've got the problem that Paul doesn't seem to go in for metaphorical apocalyptic language very much. And yet he sets it out quite clearly that he is expecting Jesus to return and it to be something that we'll notice in history.
Yes, I mean that's the big. You've actually hit the nail on the head there. Is that what can you understand the second coming in vastly different way just to get the time statements accurate? Is it not more likely in the end, as I thought in my journey, that actually it's more likely that it was a failed expectation?
You would have thought that the establishment of Jesus' kingdom on earth would have been more noticeable. If rather
than just the church.
Well, yes, that's right. There's a suggestion that it's going to be quite a big deal, and you would have expected that it would be something that people couldn't just say, "Oh, that's what it was. We didn't realise at the time." I mean, that sounds a bit anticlimactic, really, because you're built up to expect something pretty dramatic. And it's sort of all a bit quietly understated, if you accept the preterist view of things.
Yes, and of course the early church fathers didn't notice it happened. They were still expecting it.
No, that's right. No,
yeah,
they were.
That's right.
Certainly not of the opinion that Jesus had come back to earth and it was the establishment of God's kingdom on earth, that I'm aware of anyway.
This is why it happens within inerrantist groups, because they sort of are so strong on defending the Bible can't have an error. They accept the critical consensus almost that it is a soon and near and shortly thing to happen in normal, natural, understandable terms, and they're forced into almost understanding everything as happening in AD 70 to its bizarre conclusions, because it's really defending a theological view of the Bible having no errors. Jesus could not have made, or the writers or the authors could not have made such a massive mistake in their mind, because that threatens their whole faith. And so they go there. They go where you're saying it's astounding, Ed, but they go there because theology is pushing them there, if you can see what I mean.
Yes.
Were either of you ever at all tempted to go down the preterist line?
Oh, totally. I know so much about it because I was going down that line myself. Because I started off as a teenager sort of expecting the end times to happen soon, ironically, and shortly and near. In other words, all the language of the New Testament was being applied. And I just, because you read the Bible like it's being written to us. So you can read Jesus coming back soon and almost apply it to this generation, our one, and it's like, it didn't occur to me that this language is redundant once you get past one generation, 19 generations ago or whatever. And so it never occurred to me. So I moved on, and then I realized that this is where it gets difficult, Ed, though, because there are very, very scholarly volumes written by people like N.T. Wright and others who argue that a lot of the language about the second coming can actually be understood in a much more mode of the time for great events, but aren't literal, in the sense that the stars were never going to fall to the earth, in that view, that was just extreme language for the upheaval and the ending of a city or something, because the Old Testament has lots of collapses of cities when the sun and the moon and stars drop down, and yet that wasn't recorded in history as what happened. It was just that the city came to an end and doesn't have any trade anymore or commerce, and the people it's become like a desert. So there is reason to take some of Jesus' language in Matthew 24 for not being as literalistic as the fundamentalist has normally read. But it gets extremely tricky when you get to the resurrection and judgment of all men, because Paul seemed to think that at the end of when Jesus came back, we would all be changed like the twinkling of an eye, and that even Matthew says everyone shall be judged and rewarded according to what he's done. So when you have the resurrection and the great white throne judgment and the sheep and the goats all happening in AD 70, that's when I realized this is crazy. It's easier to see that it went wrong, and I need to accept it.
Yeah.
So both of you want to comment on that?
Well, I guess what I'm trying to get to a sort of simple conclusion, and to me, it's that this generation is an incredibly difficult thing to wriggle out of, and the way that people are going to such extreme lengths of craziness to accept it and find the wriggle room somewhere else shows how strong it is that Jesus really did, it's historically clear, say that within this generation all these big events are going to happen, and with the Last Judgment and the whole caboose.
That's right. I think that's the case. I mean, it makes perfect sense. I always thought, even when I was coming to that view, I thought, gosh, if something cataclysmic had happened in AD 70 beyond what happened in AD 70, like a great white throne judgment, God or Jesus lives in Jerusalem, there's a judgment of all the Roman Empire, and it all actually happened, it would be the greatest testimony to his prophecy. But when it didn't happen, Jerusalem did fall, that's true, but from the world's eyes, it was the Romans that just sacked it. It wasn't like anything apart from theology that could say anything more happened. Theology does. It says Jesus was vindicated, came to the throne of the Father in heaven, and it was the beginning of the church. So you could say something amazing happened, but it's not quite in the way that most Christians still think of the second coming. They don't think of it like that. So they bend all these soon, short and near. I mean, Ed, could you just come in, or Francis, on what I said in the group about how people have looked at shortly, soon and near?
Well, from God's perspective, things can be short and near, because God's perspective is all of eternity. So we say it's 1,000 years or 2,000 years, long time, not so much for God.
Yes, and there's a verse in the New Testament, this is what I was talking about, where we can see this tension where suddenly it says a day is 1,000 years, because in 2 Peter it talks about where is this second coming? Everything's carrying on as normal. So there's a tension there. And it's argued that it's an early 2nd century document that 2 Peter is picking up on that vibe. There is one that's quite funny, and that's that shortly and quickly is the word in Revelation, could be quickly. And some people have argued it can go on for thousands of years, but when he comes back, he'll come quickly.
Yeah, interesting.
It's like thousands of years until you arrive to visit your family, but when you get to the gate, you'll run to the door. So that's how people. Now, it doesn't make any sense really when you start to look at it. These things will shortly take place, and but that's what people do because they have to. Because if the Bible is a failed book in this area, it has enormous consequences, and I think we saw this from the guy I quoted. Ed?
Yeah, that's exactly right. I think I'll wind this up. And Andrew, thank you. I want to sort of thank the Andrew from 20 years ago and 15 years ago when you dive deep in all these theological libraries to get a handle of this stuff. And I know there's so much more in there that you haven't told us about, that you've come up with and wrestled over when you were a Christian.
Yes, I suppose so. Yeah.
So thank you for the talk, and thank you for all your information there. It was tremendous. Thank you.
Okay, so what's
now
next? Okay,
we'll move on and do our slot, Reason and God. So we will carry on with this theme of the 50 arguments for God in that book that we've been referring to. And last time we picked up on a chapter, but actually it failed to give a decent argument for God. It was instead defending against the problem of suffering. And if you remember, we were talking about the mystery card they played, and then we looked to see what the implications are if you go with that. So we haven't actually had a positive argument for God. And what I did was, because there was a lot of this in the book, of chapters saying their arguments, but actually there's nothing there, I asked around some Christian friends, and they gave me a list of arguments for God that weren't in the book that I could use to make it up to 50. And this has all gone through my randomizer. What we're going to talk about now is what's come up. It was a Catholic apologist who was talking about this, and he was using an argument from Thomas Aquinas. And Andrew, what do you know about Thomas?
Well, yeah, it sort of came up more in discussions to do with, oddly enough, the subject that we might talk about at some point in the podcast called open theism, because Thomas Aquinas is like a sort of medieval Catholic priest who is basically a sort of a philosopher, just like we have a lot of Christian philosophers today. And I remember that he was into what was called natural theology. So he had an idea, or no, it wasn't, that was before him, but he was very much into the idea that not just the scriptures were a revelation, but or personal experiences, but actually nature itself spoke of God, and then of course it was all to do with reason, and even logic is all part of God and stuff like that. So that was my sort of take from Aquinas, and very much influenced by Greek and Aristotelian thought within theology. So yeah.
Yes, he was, as you say, is very much influenced by Aristotle, and there is an Islamic scholar who preceded him, whose name escapes me at the moment, but he was very much influenced by the scholar. I think it was the one who put forward the Kalam cosmological argument. And yes, as you say, he was very focused on reason. He is undoubtedly a one of the philosophical greats, and some people regard him as one of the greatest Western scholars and philosophers in history. So yes, someone that I think you should have a lot of respect for his arguments and his views.
I guess people were expecting us to pick up on one of his 5 ways, like the prime mover argument or the uncaused cause or something like that. But actually we're going in a different direction. Those are pretty easy to understand arguments, and he sets them out in a paragraph or so in his work each. But we're going to go in a more obscure direction. So this friend of mine, he's a lecturer in philosophy at a public university in a kind of very Catholic part of the US. But he genuinely thought that this argument we're going to discuss from Thomas was a good argument and could actually persuade me to believe in God. And having looked at the argument, I'm just astounded really at that whole idea. Here is a quick summary of what we're talking about. It's an argument from the distinction of the essence of something and its existence. And so here we go. He says, this is taken by Aquinas in De Onte Essentia, which existence and essence in Latin, in his argument that everything that has an essence distinct from its existence, the act of existence is an additional thing. So what he's meaning here is like the essence of a unicorn, for example, is a horse with a central horn. That's its essence. And the whether it exists or not is distinct from that. It's distinct from the essence. He goes on, so there must be something more fundamental that doesn't have existence as an added extra, but whose essence is its existence, which is God. Now, I've struggled with this, and I can't make really sense of that.
Yeah, I mean, it's like a lot of these things. I think for the lay person out there, and in these areas, I include myself in that. Sometimes I try to get my head around even what's being said.
I think it's quite.
Yes.
It's certainly not something that is easily accessible. So, I mean, I think it's the one we're quite often seeing Catholic philosophers particularly describing God as being itself, and I think that comes back to this thing that God doesn't exist in the same way that other things exist. He is existence itself.
So, I was wondering what you were saying then, Francis. I thought you were saying God doesn't exist.
Well, from my point of view, he doesn't. But he doesn't. I think
yes.
I think I'm right
That's
in
right,
saying
but
that from this Thomistic point of view, God doesn't have existence.
He doesn't.
He is existence. We have existence. We exist because we have existence, whereas God is existence. And that's sometimes summarised as describing God as being itself.
But yeah,
the ground of all being, is that?
I think so. Yes.
Yeah. But I sometimes wonder if these people really think they're going to persuade us, or they are just trying to say, look, you're not making an effort to understand us, and if you did try to make that effort, you would be convinced.
I think there can be an element of showing off, of saying you are addressing these issues in such a superficial way. Look, here's this incredibly learned man, this incredibly intelligent man, and his argument is so complex that you could that it's really difficult for you to follow or unpack it, but you don't have an answer to it, do you? So I think it can be kind of used as a weapon for slapping people down. Have you actually studied Aquinas? Well, if you haven't gone to university and spent a good year, if you just did that as your specialised subject, getting to understand what Aquinas was arguing, then you're not qualified to speak on the subject at all, therefore go away. That is how it can be. I mean, I'm obviously I'm not saying that's universal, and I'm not saying that of your friend Ed, but I've certainly come across that slightly obnoxious approach in some Christian apologetics.
That is interesting.
Yes, I think it's more defensive than aggressive. That they feel that there is this great argument for why God exists, and the atheists who say, "Oh, that's ridiculous," don't need listening to because they haven't studied Aquinas for 3 years and all the rest of it. So I think it's more that side of things.
Yes,
But I mean, it's only an
agree.
argument.
Well, I mean, I'm not disagreeing with you, Ed. I mean, I suppose perhaps I have a slightly different and more cynical take on how it can be expressed, or on what.
But it can only lead to, if anything, an acceptance of even deism or another god, or it doesn't. I mean, it's only a plank, isn't it, to get to Jesus somehow? Because where would the God that it proves? What do you do then?
Yes, I mean, I think.
Yeah, I think it's fair enough.
William Lane Craig will often say, "My arguments don't prove the God of Christianity," or my starting points don't prove the God of Christianity. It's a cumulative thing that you have to build up. But he will say the Kalam cosmological argument doesn't prove the God of the Bible, but it proves a God who would be consistent with the God of the Bible. And then you build, and then he tries to work from there. I mean, I don't know how you feel about it, Ed, but I feel that arguments like this, and there is some scholarly debate over whether this even was put forward by Aquinas as an argument for God's existence, the essence and existence distinction, whether he did use it that way. But it's I think it's something that there can be debate on both sides, and you can find some people who will say he wasn't trying to use it as an argument for God's existence, and others who will take a different view. But my view is that it's the arguments like that and arguments like the ontological argument are a kind of conjuring trick with words, that it's interesting to try and pick them apart, but I find it very hard to imagine that anybody is actually convinced by them. It's more that you may not be able to see where the flaw.
That's right.
You may not be able to see where the flaw in the argument is, and yet it is utterly unconvincing, in my opinion.
Yes, I agree with that. So that the academic commentators are having trouble even working out what Thomas is saying, and as you say, even whether he's making an argument for God or not. And yet we're supposed to say, well, if we got deep into it, we'd be convinced. Well, of course
I
not.
mean,
and the other thing worth saying, I reckon. Oh,
yes.
Can I carry on for? Is that to do it justice, you have to sort of take your 21st century brain out and put yourself in the world of the medieval thinking, steeped in Aristotle, and think about what the debates they were having at the time, and get into this sort of pure act, and potency and all those sorts of things. That it's just big kind of leap. So you're working at a theoretical distance from reality, because reality is we understand the world through what science has told us and everything, and you have to sort of undo all that and get yourself in this other world before science
as you say, in which concepts
delivered.
Like essence and substance and potentiality were all the building blocks of how they understood the world, or how philosophers at the time understood the world, and that doesn't comport with our understanding of the world now, which has moved on from seeing these as the necessary parts of how one describes the world and things that are in existence. I mean, I do sometimes say of the of arguments like this that their purpose is really to bamboozle you more than to enlighten you, and the idea is that they are so so complex, and are, I think, often used, when they are used today, are deliberately used to be so complex that you end up bamboozled, and you can't even pick out the stage at which your bam was boozled, so as to work out where it all went wrong. And I think that there's an element of sort of hiding behind the complexity of the argument rather than seeking to elucidate.
Wow, we are, so we're being the proud, ignorant...
We are, aren't we?
Closed-minded atheists that these Thomas fans are accusing us of being.
I'm not wishing to be that.
This is quite fun.
I enjoy an argument, but I appreciate it when I feel that people are trying to make things clearer by argument rather than more obscure by argument.
Yeah.
I mean, there are people that are against Aquinas anyway in a lot of things. I mean, I've read evangelicals against Aquinas because he uses a lot of Greek understandings and Greek philosophy, and these people are all about getting back to Hebrew roots and not Greek influence, which has corrupted the church and theology and all kinds of things. And so I've come to know Aquinas that pops up in arguments like that. And so, because he was steeped in his time, steeped in Greek philosophy, and had all these concepts that the Christianity that they want to see come back or be is not an Aquinas type. So it is interesting that there are totally different understandings anyway in how to even approach some of Aquinas' teachings.
So we haven't really done a whole lot of justice to this argument, but I think we will leave it there and duck for cover while the feedback comes in from Thomas fans, if such a person is actually listening to us.
If anybody in their feedback would like to go through it and set it out in an accessible way, then I'd always be happy to read it. But it's hard for me to believe that the omnipotent and omniscient creator of the universe would not or could not have made his existence more easily understandable to his creatures and not require a 3-year study in some fairly obscure medieval concepts before you could get it.
Yeah, good point.
Yeah,
that can apply to.
So, Andrew, how will the Thomas fans give us this feedback?
This feedback to Thomas fans can come to our email, which is doubtsaloud@gmail.com. That's doubtsaloud@gmail.com, and also on our Doubts Aloud podcast Facebook. So if you just did a search for that, you will find our Facebook page corresponding to this podcast, where you could start up a discussion on any of the subjects that we've done in these previous podcasts and today's podcast. Okay, and now we're at the section of the podcast where we are going to do what we promised. And unlike the failed expectations of the New Testament, this is going to happen within the next minute or so. I was interviewed at the very first podcast, a little bit about my backgrounds. I'm Andrew, and we're going to interview Ed next week or in another podcast. But today, we're going to interview Francis. And as you have picked up so far, I find myself at home in talking all things biblical. Ed is more into the Christian philosophy kind of discussions, and Francis is coming at the evidential basis from a lawyer's approach, which is going to be very much part of her story. So we are now going to go into our interview with Francis.
So, welcome, Francis. Are you sitting comfortably?
I think so, yes. You may begin.
Now, tell me about your folks. Were they Christians? Were they atheists?
My mother was brought up as a Catholic. She left the Catholic Church and became an Anglican. I don't remember my father because he died before I was 2 years old. I believe that he was either agnostic or atheist, but as I say, I don't remember him. So I was brought up, I was christened in the Anglican Church, but we were not much more than nominal members of that church. We went perhaps, I think we might have gone occasionally on Christmas Day. It was, religion, I would say, was not big in our household.
So it wasn't a surprise to you to meet someone who believed in God?
Oh, no. I mean, although religion wasn't big, I would say that I grew up, everybody I knew believed in God. Everybody I knew would have called themselves a Christian. I would have called myself a Christian. I never really questioned that we were Christians, and for quite a lot of my life, I would say I never really questioned that God existed. I mean, it didn't have much impact on my life. I didn't place a great deal of reliance, or I suppose you would really say importance on it, but it was just one of those things I didn't think about much. Yeah, God, yeah, that's right. Everybody believes, and yeah, God exists because everybody says so. So, okay, let me go out and play,
Yeah.
Where's my bike? When do I ride my bike? It was just not a particularly large part of my life.
At some stage, you would have doubted even God's existence.
I would say I can remember having doubts when I was 11, because the Gideon's Bible Society came to our school, and they gave out Gideon's Bibles, and there was a bit in the back about, it was a bit like a frequently asked questions thing that you get on the internet these days, that was sort of, these are helpful verses for situations that you may have, and one of them was entertaining doubts. And I remember looking at that and thinking, oh yeah, right, okay, what are the verses for when you entertain doubts? And I imagine I would only have been interested in that if I was entertaining some doubts. Can't remember what the verses were, but they can't have been very convincing, because I mean I certainly didn't stop the doubts, and I began to be troubled by doubts without being particularly religious. I suppose it was always kind of at the back of my mind a nice thing to think that God existed, and that when I died I would go to heaven, which I never really questioned, that I would go to heaven. So yes, and then I think as I got into my teens, I found it harder and harder to square the lack of evidence with any sort of belief, and it was I fought a bit of a rearguard action, and partly it was because I was worried about how depressing it would be to think that when I died I would simply cease to exist. But eventually I gave up the fight, and actually I found it didn't really make any difference, that I hadn't much fancied the thought of dying when I was nominally a Christian. I didn't much more fancy the thought of dying once I became an atheist. I mean, nobody really regards being told you've got a terminal disease as like a good news story. Nobody really wants to die, and I really did not feel any different once I accepted, okay, that's it. I just don't believe. I'm an atheist.
Yeah. So you were never put under pressure to be confirmed or anything like that?
Well, I've actually missed out an important step in the story. I was confirmed. I was confirmed as a Catholic. My mother decided when I was in my teens. So, to some extent, having some doubts, my mother returned to the Catholic Church and started going to Mass again. And I started to go with her. Now, the background to this was that we had spent a year when I was 10 in South Africa, and while we'd been in South Africa, I went to a convent, and it was drenched in Catholicism and drenched in Catholic observance, and, the kind of... the charisma of the nuns and their, because it was before, Vatican II had really fully impacted on things like the way nuns lived in convents. So they had the long veils, and it was all quite, I suppose you might say, romantic in a way. And because I became fascinated by it, I was therefore quite willing to go along with my mother to the Catholic services, and to say, oh yes, I'd like to be a Catholic, which for a while gave me a sense, a rather obnoxious sense of my own self-superiority over people who were non-Catholics. And it was something that made me, in my eyes, a bit different, that on holy days of obligation, I didn't have to go to school because I went to school in the afternoon, but in the morning I would have to go to Mass. And I got taken out of religious education lessons. So it was all, it was all sort of quite pleasantly, it gave me a sense of self-importance and a sense of being interestingly different. And so for a while, I would say that kind of stopped or diverted the downward slope. But by the time I was about 13 or 14, the doubts had come back in again, and they were really not going to be answered by anything that I'd heard from any of the people in the Catholic Church. And yes, I then became not only a lapsed Catholic, but a lapsed Christian as well.
Right.
One of the questions that I wanted to put to you, Francis, was obviously I mentioned in the introduction about you being a lawyer. That whole career has a mindset in itself, and how did that sort of approach, like one of the aspects that you bring to this podcast is that evidential mind and the lawyer's mind, if you like. Can you say a bit about that and your life story?
Well, I would say that the way I approach things as a lawyer actually grows out of my degree subject, which was philosophy. I read philosophy at Reading University, and the professor at the time was the famous, or perhaps to some people, infamous, and he's been infamous to different people for different reasons throughout his life. I mean, originally he was infamous to Christians, and now he may be a bit more infamous to atheists. But I still have a very good memories of him, and I think I was very fortunate to have him as my professor. But it was more of an analytical mindset that I bring to the law. When I started philosophy, I had no long-term plan to be a lawyer. I was just interested in thinking about thinking and thinking about concepts. And so I found that in the law I could apply that ability that I like to think I have to analyse things, to dig into things, to find out what things mean, and to think through the implications of that. So it's to some extent it's not as evidential as you might think, because for me the most interesting part of the law is not so much the evidence, it's more the ideas underpinning it, and it's thinking about ideas and how you make sense of those ideas, how they measure up in relation to any particular situation that you're dealing with, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So is there a connection between your love of philosophy and sort of why you're on the podcast here with us, and your interest in these philosophy of religion aspects?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I love an argument. But I guess I would say I don't know very much. I'm not a scientist, so I can't argue about science. I'm not a historian, so I can't really get into historical arguments. But I can argue about the philosophy, and I can think about the philosophy. And it's forums like this that give me the chance to explore those ideas and engage with other people and have them challenge me and come back and try to challenge them.
Well, we can't argue with you now, Francis, as we need to bring this interview to a close. But at some point, maybe. So, Ed, what have we got next?
I'm always up for an argument.
Oh, yeah.
That's great. Yeah, thank you, Francis. That's
great.
We will now move on to the climate endnote. Now, the organisation that I advocate for is called the Citizens Climate Lobby, and our view of how to tackle climate change in the way that's sort of robust enough would be to impose a very large fee on carbon, but then rebate all the money collected to citizens as a dividend. But kind of be that as it may, what's surprising is the opposite, and that is that the government and Western governments are still actually subsidising fossil fuels. So that's like the opposite of a tax. And I found this pretty shocking. Even as late as 2016, the G7 countries only then made this commitment to phase out fossil fuel subsidies, and they were only going to do it by 2025. So this is sort of astoundingly little, astoundingly late. What we're actually doing with our Citizens Climate Lobby is joining in a wider campaign regarding the G7 meeting, which is happening next month. And we are wanting the G7 leaders to actually set out a detailed roadmap of how they're going to kind of clean out all this subsidy of fossil fuels and kind of get moving with it. So that's just a little note to sort of see what's going on. And there'll be a blog on this that I will link to in the show notes.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Ed. Well, that's the end of this month's Doubts Aloud. For those of you that have come in on this show, please do go back and listen to the previous ones, and do stick with us for the future ones. We're doing a show once a month, and we'll be looking at all kinds of interesting issues in like manner.
So do remember our request for feedback, and particularly if you leave us a review on iTunes, we will answer any question that you attach to that review. I'm Ed, and it's goodbye from me.
I'm Francis, and it's goodbye from me.
And I have been your host, Andrew, and it's goodbye until next time from me.